All right, so welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to kick off the talks today talking about some work we've done on shellfish aquaculture here in Rhode Island. And I just want to acknowledge my colleagues on this project. I've been working with Dee Jin, who's a scientist at Hui, an economist at Hui, Ali Katzanak, who's an undergraduate here at URI, Rob Thompson, who's a professor in marine affairs, and some other folks that will also be mentioned throughout the talk as well. So just to give you a little overview of what I'm going to talk about today, we'll start off talking about the context of aquaculture here in Rhode Island. I know a lot of you are familiar with aquaculture. For those of you who aren't, it'll be a little overview. For those of you who are, it'll be a review. I'm going to talk to you also about a study that we've been working on for the past couple of years to better understand what people think about aquaculture in Rhode Island. And I'll spend the bulk of my talk on that. And then I'll talk a little bit about where we're going next. So just to give you some historical context, I'm sure many of you have seen this picture from Sarah Schumann's new book. And I just wanted to start there with a little historical context that shellfish aquaculture is not new here in Rhode Island. It's been going on for over 100 years. This picture is showing you in 1908. Of the Narragansett Bay Oyster Company. And I'll give you a little more context as well. From a shell fisheries report back in 1912, the text that I've highlighted here shows you that there were over 20,000 acres of submerged lands that were used for aquaculture in the early 1900s. That's a pretty significant number considering that there's about 90,000 acres of coastal waters here in Rhode Island. Fast forward to aquaculture today and things have changed a bit. The aquaculture industry, that's when it reached its peak in the early 1900s, and then shellfish aquaculture declined till the industry itself was almost non-existent here in Rhode Island in the mid-1900s. And it wasn't until 1970s that permits started to be issued again for shellfish aquaculture. And since then, we've seen a growth in the industry. Again, for those of you that aren't as familiar with aquaculture, I'll give you some background. Most of the aquaculture here in Rhode Island is shellfish. Most of it is oysters. There are some mussels and clam aquaculture as well. Here you can see some bags where the oysters are grown. They're also grown in cages. The farms themselves are relatively small scale, with the average size being about 3 acres. Each farm has a few folks working at it. Oftentimes there's equipment at the farm, whether it's a barge or something to help tend the bags or the cages or the fish. Another picture of an aquaculture farm. As I mentioned, there's also some mussel aquaculture going on here in Rhode Island as well. This map just gives you a sense of where aquaculture is happening here in Rhode Island. We've got, it's dotted along the shoreline in various places. You can see the relative size of the farms here in the image. Most of it's happening in the southern part of the state, where the water quality is a little bit higher than in the upper bay. This graph is showing you the red line I want to bring your attention to is the area in aquaculture leases. And you can see from 1996 to 2014, was the latest year shown here, there's been an increasing trend in the the amount of acres in aquaculture farms. And as of 2014, there were 240 acres. Now compare that with the 20,000 acres we were talking about in the early 1900s, and it's not quite as significant, but it is growing, as you can see from the trend in the graph. And this growing industry is taking place amidst a number of other uses. There's commercial activities, there's recreational activities, all sorts of things going on in Rhode Island's waters. Aquaculture is managed at the state level, and the state has to try to figure out how this growing industry fits within all of these other activities within the coastal landscape. In fact, our laws here in Rhode Island actually state that the process of aquaculture should only be conducted within the waters of the state in a manner consistent with the best public interest. And so as the state permits aquaculture and plans for aquaculture and manages it, it has to think about what is that public interest. And so that's where our project comes in. We're actually trying to figure out or learn a little bit more about what the public interest, or more accurately, the public interests are for aquaculture here in Rhode Island. And we've been spending the past couple of years working on that. So we had two particular research questions that we're trying to answer through this research. And I'm going to introduce them now, and then I'm going to come back to them when I talk about the results of our project. So our first research question tries to answer the question, what factors affect why people support or oppose aquaculture in Rhode Island? Why do people support aquaculture? And we're building on models that have been developed in sociology and psychology to try to understand why people support or oppose certain management actions, in this case, aquaculture farms. And psychologists have actually developed models and where they've said that there are different groups of factors that influence an individual's support. And I've highlighted those here in the image. So you can imagine the attitudinal factors relate to people's attitudes, their values, their beliefs. That's all going to affect whether they support an aquaculture farm or not. Their personal characteristics, up here at the top. That's how old they are, what their income is, their education levels, where they live. Those sorts of things can also influence their support. The setting where the aquaculture farm is proposed, or the setting where any management action is proposed, can influence an individual's support for a policy. And then they also say that routine, or what people are used to, can affect their support for a management action. And so we're trying to build on these models to try to understand, we're using this basically as a framework to try to understand why people support or oppose aquaculture. You'll notice up in my right corner here, I put an icon that kind of captures what you're seeing on the screen. Because there's two research questions, I wanted to keep us straight, and so that's going to help out a little bit. When I come back to the results, you'll see this icon referring to question 1, why people support aquaculture. So we'll move on to question 2, which actually we're interested in trying to understand why individual support for aquaculture, or how individual support for aquaculture can be combined, and shed some light on what people think about the amount or type of aquaculture in a particular water body. And again, you can see the icon up in the corner that we'll come back to. But for this, we're trying to understand, or we're interested in understanding, at what level what are people thinking about different levels of aquaculture within water bodies? And to do that, we're building on tools that have been developed in outdoor recreation and parks literature. And these researchers have been trying to answer these types of questions within recreational settings. And they've been talking about this term social carrying capacity, which they define as the level of use beyond which environmental and social impacts exceed acceptable levels. And you can see here, I just wanted to give you an example of some images that were used in a study of a national park a few years back, where they were trying to understand how the amount of hikers on a trail influenced the experience of people visiting that national park. And so we're going to try to use that, or we've been trying to use that methodology to better understand how increasing levels of aquaculture might affect the experience of people in Rhode Island. So that gives you a little background of what the project tried to look at. Now I'm going to give you some information about what we did. We conducted a survey of Rhode Islanders. To develop the survey, just to give you a little background, we reviewed the literature. There have been a handful of studies that looked at public perceptions of aquaculture, so we tried to build on what people have already done. We attended a lot of public meetings. Luckily, while we were working on this project, the shellfish management planning process was going on, and we had a lot of chance to interact with folks in that way. And we also met with individual stakeholder groups to get their feedback on our thoughts about the survey, to get their input, and to build a stronger survey. The questions of the survey asked about people's perceptions, their attitudes, their knowledge about aquaculture in general and about aquaculture in Rhode Island. Also asked about their personal characteristics. I have a list of different types of questions that I want to share. It's a lot of text, but I wanted to let you see some of the things we were asking about in this survey. So, for instance, one of the things we looked at in the survey was we included a set of questions about attachment to place. We wanted to know how people felt about particular places in Rhode Island's coastal waters. And we focused on two particular places that seemed really important to people related to aquaculture, the salt ponds and Narragansett Bay. And so we asked questions about how frequently people visited those areas, how familiar they were, how special they thought those places were. We also asked questions about people's perceptions and attitudes about aquaculture. We included a series of statements about shellfish aquaculture and asked people to agree or disagree with the statements. So we looked at things like, some of the statements included, shellfish aquaculture is good for the economy. It provides nutritional food options. It improves water quality. It interferes with other uses. It has negative impacts on navigation. It spoils the beauty, generates too much noise, and displaces wild harvest shellfishing. And there were some others as well. We asked some knowledge questions where people could respond to some statements on whether they agreed or not with statements like this one. I consider myself knowledgeable about marine and coastal aquaculture. We asked about how far they lived from the shoreline or the coastal waters. We asked about the types of recreational activities they've been involved in recent years in Rhode Island's coastal waters. And we also asked questions about their age, their gender, household income, education level, and a series of other questions that we can talk about, but I didn't include them all for you. Another part of the survey, so those were our narrative questions, our text questions. We also included a part of the survey that involved photo simulations, where you can see here we included pictures. There were 18 pictures that we included in the survey, and I'm going to tell you more about the pictures in the next slide as well. Half of the pictures were from a general area in the salt ponds, and half of the pictures were from a general area in Narragansett Bay. Identified like this in the survey to give people a sense of where it was, but not to pinpoint an exact location. We asked people to look at the picture and to answer the question on a scale of 1 to 7. To answer this question, how acceptable do you find this setting? With 1 being very unacceptable to 7 being very acceptable. And this shows you an actual page of the survey, where each page had 6 pictures, and asked the same question that you just saw for every picture. And we varied 3 factors in our pictures. We varied the location, like I said. Half the pictures were in the salt ponds, half the pictures were from Narragansett Bay. We varied whether there was a barge in the picture, and some sort of equipment. So some of the pictures you'll see here have a barge, and some don't. So half and half. We also varied the amount of development of aquaculture in these particular areas, with 5 different levels, from none through lower, medium high, up to a higher level of aquaculture. And you can kind of get a sense from these pictures what people were looking at. Once we developed the survey, we distributed it, primarily through mail. We used a stratified random sampling of 3 different regions in Rhode Island. Because aquaculture is managed at the state level, we wanted to capture as much of the state as we could. So we divided the state into 3 parts: the inland area, south coast, and communities around Narragansett Bay. And we sent out, and we randomly selected addresses from a standard mailing list and mailed out the surveys. We also targeted some particular groups. As I said, we talked with stakeholders and found out what they thought was most interesting and most relevant to aquaculture management here in Rhode Island. And it became very clear that there were some key stakeholders that we wanted to capture in our survey. And using a random sample, we may or may not get them. So we specifically targeted waterfront property owners, and we sent additional surveys to people who live along the water in the South Coast and Narragansett Bay. We also targeted wild harvest commercial fishermen and aquaculture farmers, going to docks, dealers, sending emails out and trying to distribute the survey that way as well to those folks. All right, so to give you some, to start going over some of the findings. What did we find? Again, this is a lot of text, but I want to go through it because we'll start very general, and then we'll get a little more specific and answer those research questions that I talked about. So who responded to our survey? Well, in total, we sent out about 1,300 surveys, or distributed about almost 1,300 surveys. We got back 272 that were completed. The response rate was 21%, which is typical for a mail survey. And again, not very high, but is typical for a mail survey. Our respondents primarily had mostly had their primary residence in Rhode Island. 43% of our respondents were from the South Coast region, 42% were from Narragansett Bay, and 12% were from inland communities. So we were able to capture some views from all three regions in the state. The average age of respondents was 60. We had 64% of our respondents were male. 85% of our respondents had attended some college, with almost a third of our respondents having a graduate or advanced degree. More than 3/4 of our respondents said that they visited the salt ponds in Narragansett Bay sometimes or often. So these people are familiar with these areas that they're being asked questions of. They're highly educated. It's not surprising. Our sample distribution is not surprising. Again, we were trying to target certain groups where some of these characteristics are more expected. So again, to give you some general information about our respondents. They had an opportunity to respond to statements in the survey. One of the statements said, I consider myself knowledgeable, this first one here, I consider myself knowledgeable about marine and coastal aquaculture. And they could respond that they agreed or disagreed. And as you can see, 36% of our respondents agreed with that question, or agreed with that statement, that they consider themselves knowledgeable about aquaculture issues. A large portion of them were on the fence about whether they were knowledgeable or not, and 21% disagreed with that. In response to another statement, planning and permitting decisions about aquaculture are important to me. A significant amount of people, 72% of our respondents, said that aquaculture issues are important to them, and planning and management of aquaculture is important. 22% were on the fence, and only a small portion disagreed or didn't know enough to answer. All right. We also asked at the statement, or we provided the statement, I support shellfish aquaculture in general. I support shellfish aquaculture in Rhode Island waters near my home, and in Rhode Island waters I use the most. And we asked people to respond on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. And so that 3, the line you see going across, is a neutral line. And you can see that for all of these statements, on average, our respondents tended to agree with. So overall, our respondents tended to agree that they supported aquaculture, shellfish aquaculture in general and in Rhode Island waters and in some of those more specific places. Okay, so to talk a little bit about our specific research questions. Remember, this is that first research question I talked about. What factors affect why people support or oppose aquaculture in Rhode Island? And this is the idea that we asked a series of questions on our surveys that asked about people's personal characteristics, their perceptions, their attitudes, and as well as about what they're used to and where aquaculture was occurring. And we analyzed the data by using some statistics. We ran some logistic regressions, which basically looked at the relationship between the variables and the variable of support for aquaculture in Rhode Island waters. So we're trying to understand which factors, of all the questions we asked on our survey, which factors were most important or had the biggest effect on people's response to that statement, I support aquaculture in Rhode Island's waters. And the next slide is going to show you a lot of statements and all the factors that came out as being important. And I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about it. I'll give you a second just to look at it. I'll take a sip. So I'll draw your attention to the top part of the slide. And you can see these variables, or these statements, or parts of the data, these are the characteristics where if somebody's, an individual's support for shellfish aquaculture in Rhode Island would be higher if they agreed with the statement, I think shellfish aquaculture is good for Rhode Island's economy. Their support for aquaculture in Rhode Island would be higher if they agreed with the statement, I think shellfish aquaculture provides a healthy option for meeting people's nutritional needs. Their support would be higher if they thought planning and permitting decisions about aquaculture are important to them. If they thought there should be more aquaculture in Rhode Island. If they lived in a home where the coastal waters or the shoreline is visible from that home. If they participated in cycling. Remember, we asked people about their recreational activities. So people who went bicycling tended to have higher levels of support for aquaculture. People who attended public meetings on aquaculture or shellfish tended to have higher levels of support. And people with higher levels of education also had higher levels of support. At the same time, we found out what factors kind of influence their opposition or lower levels of support for aquaculture. So an individual's support for aquaculture would be lower if they agreed that shellfish aquaculture spoils the beauty of the coastal environment. Their support would be lower if they thought aquaculture interferes with other uses. They also thought it would be lower if they participated in birding and if they participated in sailing in recent years in Rhode Island's waters. So these are the factors that came out as being most important. We looked at a lot of different factors and a lot of different variables in our model. And these are the ones that came out and rose to the top as having the greatest influence on an individual's support for aquaculture in Rhode Island waters. So I'm going to provide a little summary at this point before I move on to the second research question, just to give you a sense of what we can do with this and what we're learning from it. So respondents were generally supportive of shellfish aquaculture in Rhode Island. We found, as I just showed you in the results from the model, that respondents with certain characteristics tended to have higher or lower levels of support for shellfish aquaculture in Rhode Island. And so what does this tell us about for management? How can this inform planning and management? Well, the managers can direct their efforts toward addressing those concerns that have the greatest influence on support. And those concerns related to aesthetic impacts, where people who thought it spoiled the beauty tended to have lower levels of support. And another concern is that it interferes with other uses. So those are some significant concerns that people had about shellfish aquaculture here in Rhode Island. They can also direct their efforts towards addressing the concerns of particular stakeholder groups. Sailors and birders tended to have lower levels of support for aquaculture. So it would be useful to try to understand why. What are the concerns, and to try to look into that a little bit more so maybe their concerns could be better addressed. All right, so that's the first research question. We'll move on to the second research question. I know I'm providing lots of information. The second research question looks at individual support and tries to understand what do people think about a particular water body. Not just aquaculture in general, but aquaculture in a particular place that they could look at in a photo simulation. And so to first try to answer this question, we wanted to know if those three features we varied in our pictures actually had any effect on people's levels of acceptability. And we found out that all three features did affect their responses, that it mattered how much development there was shown in the pictures, the level of development, the size of the farm. It mattered whether there was a barge or not in the picture, and it mattered where it was taking place, whether it was in the salt ponds or Narragansett Bay. And all three factors were significant, had a significant effect. The biggest effect was from the amount of aquaculture. The other two factors had an influence, but were relatively minor. And the last analysis I'm going to show you, or the last findings I'm going to show you, relate to this idea of levels of development. How do different levels of development affect acceptability? And I'm going to introduce, I'm just going to check how I'm doing for time. I'm going to introduce this curve, which has been used, as I said, to look at this issue of social carrying capacity or of trying to understand how people feel about different amounts of an activity, different levels of use. Researchers in the outdoor recreation sciences have used these things called social norm curves. And I'll tell you a little bit about it, and then I'll show you how we used our data to develop some social norm curves. So you can look along the x-axis here, and you see numbers. Each number refers to a number of groups encountered along a trail per day. Okay, so we're talking, this is the curve, a hypothetical curve developed in the parks literature. So as you increase the number of groups, there's going to be some effect on levels of acceptability. And these are average levels of acceptability for a group, for society, however you want to however you want to average those numbers, those levels. And so for this hypothetical curve, you start to see, well, they have a 9-point scale here on the y-axis, where 0 is the neutral point, and above that, people are finding that level are supportive or find it positive acceptability, and below that, acceptability levels are negative. And so as we move along, you add more groups you encounter along a trail, your experience tends to decline, and your levels of acceptability of that experience eventually hit a 0 point, and they call that the minimum acceptable condition. And that point has also been referred to as the social carrying capacity in the literature. And that's the point where it goes from being positive acceptability to negative acceptability. So we developed some social norm curves with our data. We were really interested in looking at comparing how different groups thought about the acceptability of different levels of development of aquaculture farms. And so we compared groups of people who had water views from their homes and those who didn't. We compared social norm curves depending on where people lived in Rhode Island. And we also compared social norm curves based on an individual's occupation. And I'm going to show you some of these curves. And you'll see in our graph here, we used a 7-point scale. Our 0 point is actually the number 4, and that's what we used in our question, so we kept it here, where 1 is very unacceptable, up to 7 being very acceptable. And here are our images, and this is for the salt ponds, the salt pond pictures, and the ones with the barge. So it was a subset of our pictures. And for each set of images, we aggregated or averaged the levels of acceptability for people with water views and those without. And so the water view folks are in red, and the non-water view respondents are in blue. In general, both groups tended to find lower levels of aquaculture acceptable. They're above that line. As we increase levels of aquaculture, once you get to the highest level here, they tended not to support that level. But you can see they cross that minimum acceptable condition at different points. And so you see our non-water view respondents on average, tended to cross the line over here between medium, high, and higher levels of aquaculture. And our respondents with water views, tended to cross it a little bit earlier, between lower and medium. And so our respondents with water views tended to be less tolerant of higher levels of aquaculture. They tended to support lower levels, but they tended to be less tolerant than people without water views. This is actually the similar slide looking at non-water view and water view, but looking at it for Narragansett Bay. And you see a very similar pattern. I just wanted to show you that we got similar results for both locations, not exactly. There was a difference between exactly where we crossed over that line for both sets of respondents, but it was similar. We also compared social norm curves for respondents based on where they lived. Because we were interested in understanding, is there really a difference? Do people who live in the northern parts of Rhode Island think really differently about aquaculture than people who live on the south coast or Narragansett Bay? And we found that there was really no difference. There was no statistical difference. They actually tended to cross that minimum acceptable condition at about the same point, suggesting that it doesn't necessarily matter where they live in terms of their levels of acceptability for aquaculture. And finally, the last comparison I want to make is by occupation. And these had significantly different responses or averages when we ran some statistical analysis on it. That at each level, there was for each picture, there was statistical difference. So we've broken them down here kind of for practical purposes, and we're still working on some of this data, so we might break it down in other ways as well. But just for here, you can see that we looked at the wild harvest fishermen, the aquaculture farmers are in green, individuals that indicated they were retired are in red, and basically the other folks, there were about 150 of them, are in purple. And so you can see that on average, some of the groups thought that lower levels of aquaculture were acceptable. Our wild harvest shell fishermen, their tolerance for shellfish aquaculture dropped off pretty quickly. And so they were not really accepting even of the lower levels of aquaculture. As we look at the other lines, we see the red line, the retired individuals, retired respondents, tended to have lower tolerance than some of the other respondents in our survey. And so they tended to support lower or medium, less than medium levels of aquaculture. Our other category, kind of a catch-all, tended to be a little more supportive with crossing over our line at medium high to higher levels of aquaculture. And our aquaculture farmers were highly accepting of aquaculture. Keep in mind that our aquaculture farmers, there were about 10, and our wild harvest fishermen, there were under about 15. So they were smaller samples, but they give some indication, and like I said, there were some statistical differences there. So that's for the salt ponds. Just to show you, we saw the same pattern again in Narragansett Bay, different set of pictures, but similar pattern comparing acceptabilities among those four groups. So what does that tell us? Well, just to summarize some of this, and I'm going to wrap it up in a couple minutes and give Emily a chance to share her research. So some of the things we found related to this question is that support for aquaculture depends on a few things. It depends on where the farm is located. It depends on the level of farm development and the type of equipment used. And that's not that surprising, but it's nice to have some empirical evidence to back that up. We found that most stakeholder groups are willing to accept some aquaculture in Rhode Island's coastal waters. But we also found that the tolerance for different levels of aquaculture varies among the different stakeholder groups. So it matters who you are when you're talking about these different minimum acceptable conditions or these different social carrying capacities. So more research is needed to better understand what these tolerance levels are and why they are where they are. So just to finish it up, where are we going to go from here? Well, we are hoping to continue this research and to keep on looking into this. We showed that we can use this approach that's been used in other disciplines to try to understand aquaculture, and so we want to keep on working on that and making it better. We expect to examine how other factors like environmental attitudes, environmental values, more broadly based, influence support for aquaculture. We want to explore how other farm features, not just the 3 we looked at, but other ones like maybe other uses in and around an aquaculture farm might affect levels of acceptability. We want to look at acceptability of specific areas, for instance, a particular salt pond or a particular harbor, and really focus in on what those tolerance levels might be for a particular area. And finally, one of the challenges of trying to transfer methods across different disciplines is that we struggled a bit with how to actually depict levels of aquaculture development, and we worked with a lot of folks to try to do it as well as we could. And at this point, we have some ideas of how to do it even better. And so we're going to try to modify, the standard questions that people ask to better account for the amount of space, whereas aquaculture is using amount of space, not just numbers of people on a trail. So we're going to try to modify that and work with that a little bit. And so with that, I will finish up and say a special thanks to some of the students who helped us out on the project, Serena Leone, Maria Vasta, who has since graduated, and Brian LaVerriere, who has also since graduated. So, thank you.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. So that was a really good setup. So my project is all about the coastal ponds in Rhode Island. And I looked into how climate change and weather factors may change levels of recreational use. And I'd like to thank Rhode Island Sea Grant for funding this project, and also Rhode Island DEM for giving us a lot of support and also letting us borrow the boat. I worked on this. This was my thesis research, and I was part of a larger project. I worked with Dr. Robert Thompson, Dr. Tracy Dalton, and Dr. James Oplich. They were the 3 PIs on the project, and also I worked with Dr. Porter Hoagland from Hui on some of my statistics. And also thank you, Meredith, for some wonderful photos that you'll see throughout this. So today I'm going to introduce the study area as well as my research, and then you'll see I split up my research into 2 main parts, similar to how Tracy presented her research. Part A, I'll show you the observed importance study, methods, analysis, and results, and then Part B, the stated importance. So I compared these 2 in my research, and then in the discussion I'll compare, and then I'll conclude. So here's Rhode Island, the ocean state, as we all know, and along the southern shore there are our coastal lagoons. And these are the salt ponds. And can I just get a show of hands? Who's been to the salt ponds? Yes, okay, perfect. I've given this talk in other places, and no one knows how special they are. So the 3 that we focused on in our study were Quannacontog, Ninigret, and Point Judith, some of the busiest ones, as many of you well know. And here are just some zoomed-in shots of these ponds. These are at low tide, and one thing we really noticed was that lower tides, we had a lot more people relaxing and taking advantage of the sandbars as the tide provided that chance. And here's Ninigret, which was a lot of fun, and a lot of the aquaculture happens around here. And then Point Judith, the largest of the 3, and we have our very important fishing port right here in Galilee. And hopefully this video wants to play. Yes, I think it's going to. So I really love this video. It was taken by Roy Bergstrom through a different project, but this is Quannacontog Pond on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of the summer, and you really get an idea for how beloved these places are. And it was one thing that I felt really fortunate for. I know, almost a collision. Feel bad for that guy trying to sail in the middle of all that. Yeah, it was just people playing around, people fishing, lots of boat activity. It was really fortunate for me to be able to come on this project, moving to Rhode Island, and get to talk to people about how much they love these places and how important they are to Rhode Islanders and visitors. So I just wanted to show you all that. I also love this photo because this is Ninigret, and you can just see how shallow it is. Everyone's clamming there at low tide. So there's 3 main points that I want to make clear before I move on. The first is that coastal recreation in Rhode Island is economically important. Of course, we know this. The second is that the coastal ponds are highly valued for recreation, as we know and as that video helps to show so well. And the third is that weather considerably affects an individual's decision to recreate. And for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on this 3rd point right now. Weather and the expectation of weather may serve as really important motivators for outdoor recreation. About 72% of the U.S. public just checks the weather every day, whether or not they're even going to be outside besides walking to their car. And outdoor recreation is related to weather factors for a number of reasons. First of all, there's a lot of weather-related activities. For example, if you windsurf, there needs to be some wind. Also, physiological factors, if you're going to be comfortable, if there's going to be sun or too much wind or humidity. And then psychological factors, which is one of the reasons why, as we saw last month, a 60-degree day in the middle of March feels a whole lot warmer than if that happened at the end of August. And while when the weather is foul, some people just put on a jacket and go out anyway, my hypothesis was that for some recreational user groups, they were going to be really picky about the weather factors that they chose to go out and recreate in. And this leads us to climate change in Rhode Island, which is going to change the weather that we experience. And based on this Horton study, which was made up of 300 scientists that looked at how climate change will affect the United States, in the summertime in Rhode Island, we can expect an increase of 3 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by 2080. 3 degrees is on the low end, which is assuming even if we stop all CO2 emissions today, that will be the lower end of what we can expect. And then 10 degrees is on the high end, assuming business as usual going into the future. And while overall we're expected to see an increase in precipitation throughout the year, in the summer they're not quite sure if in those months there'll be an increase, but we do expect an increased intensity of wind, rain, storm, and drought events. So not really going in one direction there, but just a more intense summer weather. And that may not seem like a lot, maybe, but the Wilton and Rahanto study found that a 1.8 degree Fahrenheit increase in the summer temperatures in Canada led to a 4% increase in the tourism expenditures there. So it does affect the tourism economy. And since it's so important to us, it leads us to the question, how are we going to plan for future coastal recreation and tourism here? And this led me to my research questions, which are twofold. The first is, how much do different weather factors affect different recreational activities? We can kind of assume that wind is going to be important for some uses and maybe not wanted for others. But I really wanted to see how you can compare the percentages of how much they affect different uses between the different groups. And then the second question is, how might changing weather affect the amounts and types of recreational activities that we're going to see out in the coastal ponds in the future with changing weather? And this research matters because I spent 2 years on it. But it matters because we can get a better understanding of day-to-day fluctuations in recreation and tourism. And this can help managers or business owners sort of predict what they might see in terms of their recreational users coming the day of or a few days ahead or a week of planning. And then also a better understanding of how recreation on the salt ponds may change in the future. So I investigated 4 coastal uses that we see commonly on the ponds. The first is your typical people relaxing, beachgoers, having a picnic, hanging out. The second is rowing, which included kayaking, but also stand-up paddle boards and pretty much any man-powered boat or board. Third is motorboating for recreational purposes. And then the fourth is fishing for recreational purposes, and I included clamming in that category, so hook and line and clamming. So now we're going to go on to part A, the observational preferences. You may recognize this picture from the advertisements for this event. So what we did for observational data, and this is part of the larger project again, was we counted the use. So we borrowed a really great boat from our friends at DEM. So it was a Boston whaler, and then we used a Trimble handheld computer that was running GIS software and range-finding binoculars. So on the days we were surveying, we would launch this boat on the pond. This is us at Lavin's Landing in Ninigret. You may recognize it. And then we would get out onto the water. And once we were out in the water, we would travel along these preset transect lines. And we would look off the port side, and if we saw anybody doing something, we would count them. And so we would use these binoculars here. Oh, there we go. We would use these binoculars and basically tag that person. The binoculars would calculate the distance and the bearing, and then transmit it to the ArcPad device, and it would drop a point right exactly where they were. And then this would pop up, and the researcher using the Trimble could populate what the person was doing. And these came from different studies, and when we did the same study up in the Narragansett Bay. And while we did experience a few problems, a little bit of this, and a little bit of this, we ended up with some really great data. We did this over the past 2 summers. And this is just an example of what our data looks like. This is 2015 on Point Judith. We haven't finished analyzing all this data spatially, but there's a little plug, stay tuned. That's the next paper we're working on. So we had 63 sample days over the 2 summers, 2014, 2015. It ended up being 43,892 total recorded points. So yep, there's a lot of people out there. And then what I did was I took the total daily tallies from each of those. So on this day on this pond, how many total people were out there relaxing or rowing. And then from that, I was able to do a regression analysis. And so a regression analysis is basically, these are my dependent variables here. I did all recreators and then the 4 groups. And then when you control for a few factors, the regression analysis can tell you how much do these factors explain changes in these factors. And so I was able to take the coefficients and turn it into a value that could be read as a % change. So for example, on the weekend, we see 63% more of all people recreating on the ponds. Almost 300% more relaxers on the weekends, definitely weekend people. It wasn't significant for rowboat users. Motorboaters, we saw about 130% more of them on the weekends, and fishing, 77% increase. And now we're moving on to the weather factors. So for the average humidity, for every 1% increase in the average humidity, we saw it had a negative reaction. So we saw a 2.8% decrease in all people recreating. That number got really high for relaxers, so you can see that they're very sensitive to humidity. 6.3% negative effect on rowboat users, and then about the same for motorboaters and fishing. Negative, of course, for precipitation, as you would expect. About 36 for all people recreating, and then 86 and 77% decrease in relaxing and rowboat users, so they're very strongly affected by the rain. And then motorboaters and fishing not as affected by the rain. For the wind, again, a negative effect. So for every 1 mile per hour increase in the average wind, we would see a decrease of about 7% in all recreators. It was not significant for people relaxing, which I thought was interesting. It was very strong effect on rowboat users, so 20% decrease in rowboat users for every 1 mile per hour increase. 8% decrease in motorboaters, also a strong effect for fishing, about 14. Temperature was positive, as you would expect. So average temperature, we had the strongest here with relaxing, a 5% increase for every 1 degree increase in the temperature, 4.5 for rowing, and lower for motor and fishing. And then this was something that I thought was the most interesting, was that the local low temperature, so all these other weather factors were taken from the airport, but the temperature taken at the pond, that low temperature had a negative effect. So in other words, low temperature usually happens in the early morning. The warmer it is in the early morning, the fewer of all people, relaxers, and rowboat users are out there. And this was confusing to me because if the temperature is positive, the average temperature is positive, why would the low temperature be negative? Then I was thinking about those days in the summer when it's just really hot, and maybe you don't have air conditioning, you didn't sleep well, and then, or maybe you do have air conditioning, but you wake up at 6 in the morning, you're having your coffee on the porch, and it's just already hot. Maybe you choose on those days not to do these activities. So that seemed to me to be a too hot limit that the data is indicating. But we'll get back to that, because moving on to part B with the stated preferences. This was our interview data. So we did intercept interviews of users of the coastal ponds. If you go there often, we may have interviewed you. We were out for the past 2 summers. So we did short intercept surveys of people using the ponds. We went to boat ramps, marinas, along the beach. We tried to get as much different types of users as we could, and then randomly selected the dates and times that we went, and we asked everyone we saw for an interview. So just some of the survey questions, because again, this was part of the larger project. We asked people what uses they were engaged in that day, what were the main reasons they came today, and then we asked them to rank them. We asked if they checked the weather. We asked how important blank weather factor was in their decision to come and do the use that they were doing. And we asked them on a 1 to 5 scale. So how important is the air temperature to you if you're going to come relax here? 1, not at all important, to 5, extremely important. We asked about 11 weather factors. And then we asked them an open-ended, what temperature would be too cold to come here and what temperature would be too warm? So a little background on the people that we interviewed. We would just hang out with people at their campsites and chat with them about the weather and what they thought about things. We got 283 surveys, good spread male and female. The average age was 50. Average education was an associate's with the median of a bachelor's. And the average income was $75,000 to $100,000 a year. And in response to the question, did you check the weather before you came today? About 75% of the people checked the weather before they came, so about average. And then motorboaters actually checked the weather significantly more than all the other user groups, which was interesting. Short distance travelers checked the weather significantly less than long distance travelers. This was more or less than 30 minutes traveling. And then locals checked the weather significantly less than visitors, which seems intuitive to me. So now I'm going to report on the findings from the 11 weather factors that we asked people, how important are they to you on a scale of 1 to 5. I report the means here, so these are all the people that were relaxing, and this is how they responded, how important the weather factors were to them. And then I compared them in a statistical model to all the other recreators. So that's the averages of all the other recreators, and the stars indicate that there was a significant difference between those two groups. So you can sort of read that as, for the air temperature here, people who are relaxing cared significantly more about it than all other recreational users. And in terms of the wind direction and the wind speed, they cared significantly less. They cared significantly more about the humidity and the precipitation and cloudiness, significantly less about the visibility, significantly more about the UV index, and significantly less about the tide than all other user groups. But it should be noted that, similar to Tracy's study, anything below a 3 is generally low. 3 is sort of the neutral point on importance. For rowboat users, there wasn't a significant difference between them and all other recreators. You can kind of see with the averages where there seems to be a pretty big difference. And then for motorboaters, they cared significantly more about the overall forecast, which makes sense because we did see that they checked the weather significantly more. They cared significantly less about the air temperature, but more about the wind speed and direction, less about the humidity, less about the cloudiness, and significantly more about visibility. And this, I think, describes the type of person who maybe doesn't care so much about the comfort of them or their passengers, but they're trying to figure out, are the conditions going to be good? So they really care. They're checking the weather all the time. They want to make sure that they're going to, be able to navigate their craft throughout the waterways, which many of you probably know it's not especially easy in the shallow ponds. And as for people fishing, they cared significantly less about the air temperature and significantly less about the humidity, but they did care significantly more about the tide, which also especially makes sense to me because we had clammers as well. I know it matters for hook and line, but you really need to be low tide for clamming. And now, moving on to the discussion, I'm going to compare the results from the two and sort of conclude and see what all this tells us. So in order to compare them, they have to be compared qualitatively. Took the 4 weather factors, air temperature, wind speed, humidity, and precipitation. And the top line will show the revealed importance, so the regression analysis, the percent change. And then the lower line will show the average stated importance, how important it was to people. And we'll kind of see if they match up or not. So here is for people relaxing. They said that they cared a lot about the air temperature, in fact, more than everybody else, and it did show up to be important in the model. They said they didn't really care about wind speed, and it was not significant in the model. Humidity, they said they didn't really care that much about it. It was below a 3, so it was significantly more than everybody else. But it really did affect them in the model, so that was somewhere where it didn't really match up. And then precipitation, they cared a lot, and it mattered a lot. For rowing, they said they cared about the air temperature, and it showed up as important. They said they really cared about the wind speed, and it really mattered. Again, with humidity, they said they didn't really care, but it did affect them, and precipitation matched up well. And for motoring, they didn't care that much about the air temperature, but they did care about the wind speed. It matched up. And then humidity again, and air temperature again. And precipitation, they said it was 3 important, and it did affect them, but not quite as much as the other 2. And for fishing, they didn't really care about the air temperature, but it did affect them. The wind speed, they cared about and affected them. Humidity, they didn't care that much about, but it did affect them. And precipitation, they're about a 3 as well, and it was the same as motoring. So the 2 methods matched up pretty well, except for throughout the board, humidity, people maybe don't have a good handle on how much it really affects their comfort, or maybe it sort of indicates some other weather factors going on. So then the other thing that I think adds to this, so yeah, of course weather factors affect people, but I also asked that open-ended question, what are some of the main reasons you decided to come here today? And it was open-ended so people could respond whatever they wanted. And there were, of course, a lot of repeats. So I found that the most common and what people said was the most important reason for them to be there was to fish. So about 17% of people said that. And then I know this is sort of relaxing or confusing, and I thought so too. So I weighted all of these responses. So if they said it was the most important, it got a 3. If they said it was the second most important, it got a 2. And you can see that fishing just came out to be the most important reason that people were there of the open response. Relaxing was the second most important, and then weather was the third most important. So I think that it's interesting that weather is in the top 3, but I think it's also interesting that the fishing people responses seem to not care that much about the weather and the conditions, and it seems because they were really just there to fish. And then the question, is it ever too hot? So especially with climate change, we're going to have higher temperatures. Are we going to see a drop-off or an increase? What's going to happen? And we saw those local low temperatures that had the negative correlation. So that kind of indicated that it might get too hot. So I asked people, what would be too warm? What would be too cold? And some people said, no such thing as too warm. Bring it on. I love it. But some people said, after this certain temperature, I'm not going to do this. It's too hot. So to compare the percentages, 61% of people relaxing said after a certain limit, it will be too hot and I will not be here. So that was more than all the others. For rowboat users, it was a significant difference. 70% of them had a limit after which they would not come to the pond to recreate. And that was significantly higher than all other users. For motoring, only 15% of motorboaters had a limit. In other words, 85% of people who were motorboating said, bring it on, I love the heat, it can't be too hot, let's do this. And that was a significant difference. And then fishing, again, significantly more than all other users. They did have a thermal limit after which they would not come and fish. So that sort of leads me into my conclusions. Why does all this matter? The methods seem to match up, and they did show that there is a difference among the different recreational user groups, which is important because when we talk about tourism and recreation, we tend to lump them together, but I think it's really important to think about how the different users might react to changing weather factors. And then fishermen seem to care least about the weather being nice, and motorboaters also, and they seem to care more about the conditions, which are also, of course, important weather factors. And some days are definitely too hot for some recreational user groups, particularly rowing, which was supported in both methods, possibly relaxing and fishing, and likely not for motoring. So motorboaters seem to be the most resistant to hot temperatures. So for the short-term fluctuations, I think this research can help managers of recreational operations better estimate the volume of visitors based on the weather forecast and not just, oh, it's a weekend or, oh, it's a weekday. So, state beaches, how many lifeguards are we going to need? Well, what's the weather going to be like? Kayak rentals, boat ramps, sport fishing operations. You can sort of tease out a little bit with a little bit more specificity what you can expect. And that leads to better success of our tourism business here in Rhode Island. And for those long-term trends with climate change that we were talking about, longer summer, definitely good for business in a beach tourism community. But we might see in the peak of the summer when it gets really hot that there might be a sort of dip down in the people rowing and relaxing. It might get too hot for them. And it might be a shift on the coastal ponds towards motoring, which could have implications, could be good for business, or maybe there might be crowding on some of the boat ramps. So these are things we're going to have to think about as we move forward with climate change. And the increased weather intensity I thought was really interesting. And this is something I heard a lot from people I interviewed. Motorboaters and fishermen would say, well, what kind of rain? Is it going to be thunderstorming or just drizzling? I'll go out in the drizzle. So when we get that increased intensity of storm and rain events, maybe on those days we'll see fewer people overall. You're not going to get the fishermen hanging out in the rain anymore. It's going to be nobody out there. But maybe with the increased weather intensity, we're also going to have more nice days. So maybe that'll be better overall. So I just want to say thanks to the team of 2014 and 2015, and thanks to to Rhode Island Sea Grant, URI, Rhode Island DM, and all the coastal pond users who participated in the study and love the coastal ponds. Thank you. That's a good point. I forgot to add that caveat. The question is, considering climate change, whether we also have to sort of consider sea level rise along with that, of course, in coastal areas. And I have looked into it, and there's no certainty of what the ponds will look like, though they will likely change quite a bit with sea level rise. It unfortunately wasn't in the scope of my study, but there's debate on, how the sand will move. Maybe they'll get shallower, or maybe they'll get deeper. That's another great question. Is there even going to be the resources to clam and fish? And ocean acidification is another consequence of climate change that is definitely going to affect clamming and fishing. And again, not in the scope of my project, but that was sort of in my conclusions in my thesis, is that weather factors may not change how fishermen behave, but certainly the availability of the resource. And I thought that was especially true when we saw that the biggest reason people were coming to the ponds was to fish. And that's one of the consequences of climate change that we really need to keep an eye on that might really affect our local economy, is how important that is down in the coastal ponds anyway.
Meredith is asking about how our research how responses to some of the questions we asked might change, or how understanding what people think about aquaculture might change as climate changes. I think that one of the things that we do want to look at in the future is to try to understand. So when we do these types of studies, we have to limit the variables we look at in the survey, or people will get through a couple pages and throw it in the trash. So we try to limit some of the things that we're looking at. And so we only looked at 3 factors, as I had mentioned, in terms of our photo simulations. But we would like to look at, in another study, try to understand how different maybe recreational uses might affect how people think about aquaculture. If we included kayakers, if we included motorboaters, if we included clammers in these pictures, in these photo simulations, is that going to affect how people think about or support aquaculture? So, sure. And as we showed, at least looking with the information that we provided, there is some point where different stakeholder groups are finding that that level of aquaculture development is no longer acceptable. So, like I said, the way we asked the questions looked at kind of general levels of development. We'd like to refine that a little bit more and try to better understand where those levels might occur, and maybe for particular water bodies. So, I'm not sure if that answers, but right. Yeah, and that's a good point. And so we're hoping that the findings from all of these studies that we've been working on will inform some of those discussions. We don't really have the answer to it, at what particular number of farms is it all of a sudden we're going to have to shut the operation down. But trying to get to that point, give a little more information to policy discussions, so when people are sitting around and trying to figure out these things, they can refer back to some of this. Well, so our like I said, we used a stratified random sample, so we got some random residents throughout Rhode Island. But we did also target some groups, and we targeted waterfront property owners, which you saw some characteristics there where there were some higher education levels. A lot of our respondents were retired, which tend to be characteristics of that population of waterfront property owners, which we don't have a statistic to compare it to, but that's kind of where we're thinking those numbers are coming up. So we sent out about 1,300 surveys. And like I said, there was a 21% response rate, which is not as high as we'd like it, but it's typical for male surveys. Sure, again, kind of for that same reason that we targeted certain groups. So we targeted waterfront property owners, and again, we think that waterfront property owners tend to be older than the general population. So that's probably reflected in our respondents. Okay, so you're asking why isn't there a saturation point? And that's a great question. It's not the question we examined. There could very well be. So we set out to look at aquaculture specifically. And like I said, in these types of studies, you do need to limit what you're looking at in order for people to actually get some good data and to look at answer some of these questions. So we only looked at aquaculture, but the same type of study, like I said, actually originally the methods we used actually came out of recreational literature. So we could use a very similar study, similar approach to look at recreational uses, look at shoreline development. Yeah, and I completely agree, and that's why I was saying our next steps are to start looking at what other factors we can start to delve into a little bit. I had mentioned, so, you know, if you get a survey like this, and it's 9 pages long, if we vary a lot of the factors, we end up expanding the length of the survey. So to limit it, we focused on 3 particular factors. We would really like to look at what happens when you start adding in other conditions, like you were mentioning, recreational uses, the shoreline development. If you noticed, our images did not have any development, and that was on purpose. We actually removed some housing that was in the pictures to minimize that effect in this particular study. But it would be something to look into in the future. I'm running through the different studies in my head, and I don't know if anybody's looked at that for aquaculture. They've certainly looked at it for other types of projects in the marine environment. So I have done some work on marine protected areas, and people look at that. What happens when you put it in tomorrow versus 10 years after it's been in place? And so that could be something that could be looked at. I don't think there's any empirical studies that have looked at that question yet.
The question is, have resource managers used studies about climate change and weather factors to manage the resource? I haven't seen any. So most of the literature is looking at sort of long haul travel if Caribbean destinations or the Mediterranean is going to become too hot for vacationing and beach trips. And there's been a lot of studies on that, and it's definitely a concern there. But I haven't seen any changes because of it. And I don't know what they could do, as they can't really move destinations. And that's one thing I really loved about this study, was because it's on such a localized scale. Maybe something could be done to, make us a little more adaptable. But I haven't seen any. Good question. Thank you. We could have that answer. Yeah, we actually have that data. We haven't actually, it would be very easy to find that out. I don't know off the top of my head. I could give you a super ballpark percentage, but it could be very wrong. I would guess about 80-20%. But that's on the ponds that we've studied based on our data, which Point Judith, of course, has a ton of commercial activity. So, it would depend on the water body, but that's what I've guessed just looking at our data.
So there was a study, there were some studies just published in 2015 in British Columbia on shellfish aquaculture that looked at public perceptions. Our study was a little bit different. They did ask people about their perceptions, and then they didn't look at whether those perceptions influence support like we were looking at. So it was a little bit different. So our findings aren't necessarily matching up with what they found just because of the way they looked at the question. What's interesting is their sample was very similar to ours, and I thought that was interesting, in terms of looking at coastal communities and trying to get some respondents in those areas. Their sample was older and had a different, kind of some of the same characteristics that we had as well. And in terms of some of the other studies, again, no studies have really looked at what factors are most important for affecting support. They've kind of asked people what they think about a list of perceptions, and tried to understand, do people think aquaculture affects water quality? Do people think aquaculture interferes with other uses, like we were looking at? And so we used those studies to build our list. And actually, to go back to something Bob had asked about, did people's knowledge levels affect their support? And I was responding in terms of those curves, but when we ran the regressions, the knowledge questions did not come out as being statistically important or have a big influence on people's support or not. And we actually found that people's perceptions, like whether people thought, overall, people's support, understanding of aquaculture For instance, whether people thought aquaculture affected water quality did not affect their support for aquaculture. It wasn't like everyone who thought aquaculture negatively impacted water quality then opposed aquaculture. And so those things are important because a lot of times we hear that there's a set of perceptions that we think people have that affects their support for aquaculture, like, oh, the people who think it affects the water quality, who think it affects fisheries, are going to oppose it. And we didn't find that in our study. There were only a few perceptions that really mattered to people, and that was the aesthetic perceptions and some of the use perceptions. Right. If we left the houses in, then there's a chance. So the question is, I'm guessing, kind of making a question out of it, that there are that it may not be depicting what you're actually seeing in the ponds. And so again, we worked with stakeholders, and we did try to figure out how we could develop a scenario, a simulation that would get at some of these questions, that would try to see, can we use this approach in understanding aquaculture? For this first study, and again, this is the first time this type of approach has been used for aquaculture, if we added in housing, to see if it had an effect, we would then have to double the number of pictures we use to have half houses and half not. And so then that would increase the amount of time people have to take, or the amount of time it takes to do the survey. And again, that's something that we struggle with as social scientists. How big are we going to make this survey? At what point it's going to affect our response rate? And so at this point, this is our first step. And so we're hoping to add those factors in and see how they affect people's perceptions of aquaculture as well. All right, so again, asking about the simulations. One of the simulations actually in the salt ponds didn't have any aquaculture. Didn't have any development behind it. And the picture in Narragansett Bay had a house. And so that's why we removed the house from the Narragansett Bay picture, because we did want to, again, if we had one house, then that could be affecting what people thought. So it was either add houses to the salt ponds picture or take them away from the Narragansett Bay picture. And that was just a decision we made.
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is something that you struggle with when you're studying perceptions of weather factors, because, again, it does change. Your perception of weather changes based on what you're experiencing or what you expect to experience. And a lot of the studies that I read that I was basing my research off did tests every 15 minutes on what the weather was, and then how people responded based on that. And because I was lumping my research within the larger project, and again, not trying to make the survey too long for people, I wasn't able to add in questions based on what the exact temperature was at that moment. But I can't really, I was actually surprised, I guess, when what limits people would say, oh, I won't come here if it's over 88 or 85. And I would, think to myself, it's definitely over 85 right now, why are you here? But yeah, I didn't really notice any patterns with that. But I did hear a lot of people saying, the people who said that there was no limit, they would say, I'm here because it's hot, which of course makes sense. So, but that was also another thing that I thought was interesting, was maybe, be interesting to do this study again, but on the beach, because I think I hypothesized that people might choose to go to the beach over the salt ponds on days that are really hot, because you don't get the wind like you do on the open ocean beach. So I would love to study that.
Yeah. I'll start it, and then I'll give it over to Emily too, because she has some better ideas than I have. But I think that's a great point, just combining some of the information from both studies. And again, like I said, one of the things and we're working on a proposal as we speak to try to look at some of these issues, but it would be great to look at more specific areas. We tried to keep it general for this first, we said the general salt ponds, and that's why we didn't want to give a specific spot, because we knew some people might say, that's the spot, I know that area. And so we kept it general, but now we're kind of interested in saying, well, let's look at a specific area. Now that we know a little bit more about what's going on there, we can develop those types of questions for another survey.
Yeah, I think that being out there on the ponds for the past 2 summers interviewing people, one of the limits of a structured survey is that when people say other things, there's not a place where you can record it and add it into your data. And so people would say really interesting things that I wished we could have, been able to capture and quantify. And some of it was about conflicts, and a lot of it was about surprising ways that different uses coexisted that I wasn't sort of expecting. And I guess not completely related, but we found that people really love to go to the beaches and overlook Galilee. And I just sort of always assumed that the more pristine the environment, the more desirable the beach. But these people kept saying to us how much they loved sitting there and watching the ferries and the fishing boats going in and out. And that was just one finding that we found to be a little bit different than what one would assume, and something that we'd love to research more.
So the question is, have people looked at, in studies before, looked at recreational carrying capacity in water type settings? And so social carrying capacity has been looked at. So this methodology that we borrowed from has been used for decades, and people have written about social carrying capacity in recreational settings since the 70s. And many studies have been done in water type settings, so whether they're fresh, a lot in freshwater. In coastal settings, there have been a few. There's a professor out at Oregon State who does work on using this methodology in marine settings, and he's looked at coastal uses, primarily scuba diving, boating in these types of places, and used similar types of images to try to understand what people think, varying the size of the boat, the numbers of boats, those sorts of things. So people have looked at it in a recreational setting in marine and coastal environments. And we did, in our study that Emily presented on, like she said, we did ask people what they thought about other uses that they encountered while they were out on the ponds. And so we do have some data on that. Like she was saying, we have some data on what people think about other uses and kind of their levels of almost acceptability or levels of support for other uses as well. So that's another talk for another time, but happy to talk about it. Yeah.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. The question is the areas of the map that didn't seem to have as many observational points, were they blank because we weren't studying there, or was it because there really wasn't that much activity? We did our best to get everywhere we could. Our boat could get almost everywhere. Sometimes at low tide, not so much. So there are definitely areas that we didn't see a lot of activities. There are a few nooks and crannies on the ponds that we couldn't get into, like Phosphorus Cove on Ninigret we couldn't get into. But yeah, those are areas where there are just fewer boats. And Point Judith maybe wouldn't be the best example if we were going to look into that, because the channel, there's always so many boats in the channel. So when you started comparing inside the channel to the other side of Great Island, it's going to look like a big difference. But on ponds like Quani or Ninigret, it wasn't such a stark difference. Thank you. The question is, do we vary the survey by times of day? So we were out on the boat, usually about between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. all day. So we weren't out there super early doing the observational data, and we didn't stay into cocktail hour. But just the limits of the study, we can't be out there all the time. So we were out there the whole time. So I think we captured at least, if it was fishermen, at least we caught them coming back. And the point of the larger study was really to see where everybody was, especially at the points when the ponds are being the most used. So I think we captured that pretty well, although we did miss the really early morning and the late evening. And then for the interviews, in the first year we were out at 6 a.m., I think. And then we ended up in the second year not being out as early because it was just, a waste of time. We would get maybe one if we were lucky.